Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 7, Assessment, Measurement, and Bilingualism. This is going to be the lecture. The PowerPoint's posted on the website. So I'm going to share my screen with you and get started. So here we are with assessment and bilingualism. It's a tricky topic. We're not going to all become expert psychometricians at the end of this module. But I do want you to have sort of a sense of some of the bigger issues in assessment and how those play out when they're applied to bilinguals and when they're applied to thinking about bilingualism. And so I'm going to try and make a distinction between those two things. They're, of course, related, but they're not exactly the same. So to get started, you will all sort of know, I'm sure, about summative and formative assessments. Summative assessments are given at the beginning or end of a unit or out of a period of time, and they give a broad sense of performance. So the MCAS, for example, is a summative assessment. Formative assessment are assessments you might use in your classes when you're trying to get a sense of where students are at after a period of instruction or during a period of instruction. The goal being to assess your students' strengths, weaknesses, and understandings so that it can affect how you design instruction going forward. Again, summative's meant to see what have students learned or how are they performing on a given construct. And we'll talk about constructs in a minute. Assessment types, we have norm referenced assessments. And so when a test is normed, that means it's given to a large sample of people, usually from varying age groups, and they form the norming sample. So if I design a test like the SAT, for example, it's given to a large group of people, and then I get the average performance of that sample of people, and that is my norming sample. And then when an individual now goes and takes the SAT or the GRE or some other assessment, their performance for their age level is compared to the average performance of that norming sample for that grade level. And so this individual performance can then be located on a percentile. 50th percentile means you've done about exactly the same as the average person in that norming sample. 90th percentile means you've done better than 90% of the people in that norming sample. 10th percentile means you did better than only 10% of people in that norming sample. So when you're norm referencing, in order for someone to do well, someone else must do poorly. It's designed that way. By contrast, criterion reference tests are not normed, they're mastery-based, so anyone can do very well on them. It's not dependent on somebody doing poorly. The MCAS is an example of a criterion reference test. Everyone can perform to high levels on the MCAS. It's not normed, but people are compared to each other. Students are compared to each other, but their performance is not dependent on the performance of another. So those are the sort of four basic assessment types. Here's a way to cross-tabulate them. Norm referenced, criterion referenced, formative, and summative. So summative norm reference tests are like the GRE and the SAT. Summative criterion reference would be the MCAS. Norm referenced formative would be things like the DIBELS, the Fountas and Pinnell has some assessments built into it. And formative criterion referenced often are teacher designed tests and activities that give you a sense of where students are at, but they're not meant to compare students such that doing well, one student doing well on it requires another student not doing well. So another big issue in assessment, broadly speaking, are issues of reliability and validity. So reliability is how reliable is a measure. So if you take a measure and you give that measure to the same student repeatedly, will the performance on the measure be similar over time? And so one of the big forms of reliability in testing is called test-retest reliability. And that's when, for example, with reading measures, you assess reading in the fall and you assess it again in the spring. Typically, individual students' performance in the fall is highly correlated with performance in the spring. And that's what's called a test-retest reliability. That is, if you do well in the fall, you're likely to also do well in the spring, and vice versa. So in some ways, that's a comforting thing about a test if it's reliable from test to retest. But on the other hand, the point of intervention is to disrupt the correlation, right? So if you implement a good reading intervention, for example, for a student who in the fall scored poorly in reading, then that correlation should be disrupted. That is, the low performance in the fall should not be predicting low performance in the spring. You would hope that the association was negative. That is, the low performance in reading in the fall actually is associated with higher reading performance in the spring. So there is sort of this difficulty in the idea of test-retest reliability with these kinds of standardized measures, because really what you want to do is disrupt that correlation. But the fact is that lots of us know that, if you're a good reader in the fall, you're likely to remain a good reader in the spring. The next thing is validity. So going along with reliability is how valid is a measure. That is, whether the measure, even if it's reliable, is it measuring what it says it measures? And so we'll think about that a little bit more, particularly, for example, in terms of vocabulary, but also ideally for this module, one or all of you in your group have brought some assessment with you that you can evaluate on these criteria. So is it valid? Does it measure what it says it measures? And there's many forms of validity, but the two I wanted to focus on were construct and cultural. Construct validity is, does it capture the construct of interest? So if you say you're measuring vocabulary, how is it that you're going about measuring vocabulary? So that means how you conceptualize vocabulary and how you assess it is very important. And we'll look at a measure, an example of that soon. Cultural validity is, does the measure reflect sociocultural influences that shape student thinking and the ways in which students make sense of and respond to items? So whatever items are on your measure, for example, of vocabulary, is it reasonable that students might actually know it, given variable cultural backgrounds? So if you put a picture of the Louvre, for example, on your vocabulary test and you say, what is this? It's arguable that that does not have high cultural validity for students who have never been to Paris before, right? So it's things like that. It's like, so what is it measuring? So if you have low cultural validity, you're likely to also have low construct validity, especially if you're administering a measure with a group of students who've never been to Paris before. Or if you gave me a test of farm vocabulary, I don't know a lot of terminology around farming, so I would do poorly on that kind of a vocabulary test. So it would have low cultural validity with me, but higher cultural validity with students who have grown up in rural areas around farming communities. So communicative language assessment is a form of assessment that is summative. And I thought it would be just interesting to look at. And so this is one of the assignments. This is called the APPLE. People may have heard of this before. It's often used for seal of biliteracy testing, so I thought it would be worth looking at. And so if you go to the URL that's listed here, you can scroll down and you can see there's a number of languages represented. And I wanted you to choose one of them, one of the languages, Arabic, Japanese, Spanish, and you can choose in those languages either beginner to intermediate or intermediate to advanced examples of assessment items for the different modalities. So those four categories of modality are interpretive listening, interpretive reading, interpersonal listening and speaking, and presentational writing. So go through and have a look at those and see what you think. And particularly for the activity is thinking about the political dimension of assessment that's written about in the Foundation's text. How can you apply that political dimension to these testing items. You know, what would the political dimension of the political critique of assessment have to say about the nature of these tests? And think also about cultural validity, and have they dealt with that appropriately? Okay, so you can pause me here to do that activity. And then once you're done, move on with the video. Okay, we're back. I hope that was interesting for you. So now I want you to remember the 3 bilingual frameworks that we went over in the foundations class. Remember, there's the 2 monolingual frameworks, where this idea that bilinguals are 2 monolinguals in the same brain. There's the common underlying proficiency framework that says that you have surface features of L1, surface features of L2, and there are just things that are commonly known, the common underlying proficiency. This could be things like scientific knowledge. It could also be knowledge that sentences end with periods, or that reading proceeds from left to right in certain languages and right to left in other languages, or how to hold a book. That can be part of your common underlying proficiency too. So these things, this common underlying proficiency can transfer from the first language to the second language as long as proficiencies in both are relatively high. And then of course there's the cross-linguistic framework, which is thinking about how L1 and L2 are sort of arbitrary, they're arbitrary constructs, and really as bilinguals, our languages are always mixed. And we just determine how and when to use them and let them mix depending on the context we're in. So those are those 3 frameworks, just a quick reminder. And so you'll recognize some of this from the foundations class. So now moving into assessing bilinguals, assessing bilingual people. And this has some issues with misestimation. So norm referenced assessments, those are tricky because here's the first part. Their norming samples typically don't include bilingual people. That has been the case typically in the past. So if you're assessing a bilingual student and then you're comparing that student's performance to a norming sample that does not include bilingual students, then many psychometricians, social scientists have argued that you're essentially comparing apples and oranges. And so the bilingual's performance is not a good reflection when you compare it to a monolingual's performance. And so you're misestimating their knowledge. In this case, the example is vocabulary. And the other, of course, relating to the common underlying proficiency is that assessments are usually monolingual and they might underestimate true knowledge. So here's an example of the Woodcock-Munoz vocabulary test. And so kids are expected to look at this array of pictures on the left. And the question is, you point to the ice cream cone and you say, what is this? And the student is supposed to say ice cream. And you point to the drum and you say, what is this? And the student is supposed to say drum, and cow, flashlight, toothbrush, rocking chair, and so on. And so if you look at these, if you just give this measure in English, it may be that the student gets items 1, 2, and 3. That's indicated by a 1 next to each of those, and a 0, 4, 5, and 6, flashlight, toothbrush, rocking chair, they get wrong. And so that's a total of 3. If you just stop there, this bilingual student looks like they only knew 3 of 6 items. But if you re-administer those missed items in the second language, or excuse me, in the first language, you can see that in Spanish, the student now gets 5 of the 6 correctly. And so that's a better estimate of students' vocabulary knowledge. But in most cases, assessments are not done this way. They're done the first way. That is, they're administered to bilingual kids in a language in which they might not be yet fully proficient. And that would be English in this case. And so you have this problem of misestimating what kids know with lots of assessments. And then there's assessing bilingualism, right? So the first one is assessing just, for example, vocabulary knowledge or misestimating it. The other way to think about assessing bilingualism is trying to know something about what are the levels of both languages that the student has to get a sense of their bilingualism. And this is difficult because of the problems that we just talked about in the previous slide. That is, assessments are typically delivered monolingually. They're very rarely cross-linguistic. because those are very difficult assessments to put together, to norm, etc. And so the two monolingual frameworks is the norm for assessing bilingualism. So you have performance in Spanish vocabulary would be X, performance in English vocabulary could be Y. And then you put those kids' performances on a norming scale, and you try to make some determinations about their degrees of bilingualism. This is very typical. And the problem with this is you end up with something, the potential of the specter of semilingualism. So here's some vocabulary data from 2, 4, 6, 7 different schools 11 through 18, kindergarten. And these are on average scores for groups of children in classrooms, but you could also have this, you could think of this as student 11, 12, 13, 14, 16, 17, and 18 also. So you can think of this as averages within a classroom, or this is the individual performance of a student. Either way, the effect is the same. And so what you see is, if you look at value on the left, a value of 100 is average norming sample. So a standard score in this case is an average of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So anything between 85 and 115 is somewhere in the realm of average. Anything below 85 is considered below average. Anything above 115 is considered above average. So if you look across these, you can make some, rough estimates about levels of or degrees of bilingualism. So in school 11 or student 11, you have very high English, very low Spanish, right? In school or child 12, you've got average English, low Spanish. In school or child 13, you have low Spanish and low English and average Spanish. 14, you have average English, low Spanish. 16, you have super high English, super low Spanish. And here's the specter of semilingualism. School 17, you have low performance in English and in Spanish. And finally, in 18, you have average English and low Spanish. So you see some trends in terms of what language appears to be dominant in these cases, which is English, except in child school 13. But the danger of the two monolinguals framework is child school 17, where you might come away thinking, based on the two monolinguals framework, that this student just lacks language, right? And the term way back in the old days was semilingualism. We don't use that term anymore, but the danger of the two monolinguals framework in bilingual assessment is that we come to the conclusion that students simply don't have language. And that's not true. Again, it gets back to the validity of the assessment. And this is the very assessment that I'm going to go back that we're looking at here with this array of pictures. And so we need to ask questions that, if we get results like this with student 17, why might that be? We don't necessarily want to just put the responsibility on the student and say, oh, the student's low in both languages, doesn't have much language. That's likely not the case, right? So where is the disability? Is the disability in the student, or is the disability in the assessment? And that's the question I think that we always have to be asking of assessments in terms of validity, reliability, how it's normed, whether it's criterion referenced, and who's performing well and why. So what we want to do in all cases is not think of kids as low in language generally. All kids can use language effectively for the most part, barring atypical development. So it's something very important to keep in mind as you administer and interpret assessments, particularly with bilingual students. So here's an example of a cross-linguistic approach using monolingual measures, however, that's a little more statistically sophisticated, but it does show how you can think about the two monolinguals framework such that it can be applied cross-linguistically. This is some research that I did quite some time ago, back in 2005 with my colleagues. This was part of my dissertation, where we used very similar measures like the vocabulary one I was just showing you, Spanish vocabulary. But then we also had a measure of English reading comprehension, which was kids reading close passages, like the house is bigger than the, and there's a blank, and then there's a picture of a man standing next to a house, and so you fill in the blank. They, like the vocabulary, the reading one gets harder and harder. So the pictures go away, the passages get longer. With the vocabulary one, again, I'll back up. You start with ice cream and rocking chair, but you get into things like anvil and Arc de Triomphe. Again, getting to cultural validity, but it gets harder and harder. And then English reading fluency was the speed and accuracy with which students could read real words in English, so decoding skill. And so what we did was we said, does performance in Spanish vocabulary, is that associated with performance in English reading comprehension? And we were already controlling for English vocabulary because we knew English vocabulary is very correlated with English reading. So we wanted to know, in addition to English reading predicting English vocabulary predicting English reading, does Spanish vocabulary also predict English reading? And the answer to that was yes, there was an association between Spanish vocabulary knowledge and English reading comprehension. But if you look at the 3 lines, the association was strongest for kids in the 75th percentile on the norming sample in fluency. So the kids who were the most adept readers of English, those kids, for those bilingual kids, Spanish vocabulary knowledge was predicting English reading comprehension. You can see that in the solid black line. You can see the slope is much higher than the 25th percentile students, which is the dotted line. There's simply no effect of Spanish vocabulary knowledge on English reading comprehension. And so basically what that says is, if you're already a good English reader, maybe that frees up cognitive energy for you to apply your Spanish vocabulary knowledge to the task of English reading. Or at least that's one interpretation of it. Even at the 50th percentile, that middle group who are average English readers do see an effect of Spanish vocabulary on their English reading. So this was sort of an example of using more sophisticated statistical techniques, if rather than just comparing performance in one language and another, you can sort of use the monolingual measures to model cross-linguistic behavior. And this is one example of how that can be done. But part of the problem is assessments don't always exist in other languages. So the MCAS, as we all know, is in English only. At one time, they had a Spanish version, at least in math, which I think sometimes can be given, but they do that under the premise that math is a universal language, and so it shouldn't matter what language you give it in. To me, I'm not sure how compelling an argument that is when it's not also applied to language arts, but anyway. And dual language schools struggle to find good Spanish diagnostic and summative assessments. They just don't exist in the same kind of, with the same kind of volume as the English assessments do. And if you think Spanish diagnostic and summative materials are difficult to find, try finding them in Haitian Creole, Portuguese, or Mandarin, which are the other sort of higher profile dual language schools or programs that are here in the Commonwealth. So on the one hand, thinking about a bilingual assessment is sort of interesting and has lots of pitfalls. In other ways, it's hard to even get to the point of the interest in the pitfalls because the tools aren't always out there, and we need to find them and make sure they're good before we use them with to any kind of scale. Or when we assess more than we teach. And so this is getting to activity number 2. Take a look at Brenda Casilius's memo. She's the superintendent of the Boston Public Schools, announcing a moratorium on standardized testing in the BPS. And so the question for this activity is, do you agree with this, yes or no? There's also a second option that you can see on the on Module 7 on Canvas. So if you don't want to do this one, there's a second option of just writing an opinion piece on a different topic. So think about that. Should we simply do away with standardized assessments? You know, the MCAS is a standardized assessment. It's not norm referenced, but it is standardized. Everyone takes the same test, right? Within a given grade level. So it's standardized, but it's not norm referenced. So do you agree with this? Would you do it if you were the superintendent? And check out her sort of justification and rationale for making the decision. Okay, that is the end of the assessment lecture. Thank you for listening, and good luck with the rest of the module.